Hello, I'm David Inouye, and I'm chair of the board for NAPPC. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person. Maybe next year we'll be able to get together in Washington, D.C. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the things that NAPPC has accomplished during its 20 years. So in 2006, NAPPC released a white paper and recommendations on issues surrounding non-native bumblebee importation, and that was for use by agricultural and environmental policymakers in the United States and in Canada and Mexico, since NAPPC is involved in all three of those countries. The picture here on the bottom left shows Bombus terrestris. This is actually a non-native to North America. It's a European species that was developed for commercial use by at least two companies in Europe and has now been distributed to a variety of places around the world. Unfortunately, it has often escaped from the greenhouses where it was introduced for pollination, often of tomatoes, and is now established in the wild in a number of places around the world where it is not native. One of those places is in southern South America. It was introduced into Chile for pollination, but has flown over the border into Argentina. And that bee species shown on the bottom right is one of the larger species of bumblebees in the world, Bombus dalbomii. And unfortunately, it has almost disappeared from its former range in Argentina because of both competition and introduction of diseases from that European bumblebee species, Bombus terrestris. So that's the kind of issue that we were trying to point out to policymakers here in North America that we needed to be aware of. Another major accomplishment of NAPPC is having helped to develop this 2007 report from the National Academy of Sciences about the status of pollinators in North America. So we suggested that study to the National Academy. We helped them to fundraise to make that study possible. And there were multiple NAPPC scientists who were participants in that study. This was probably the first study for a whole continent of what is the status of its pollinators. And one of the unfortunate outcomes of that was that we found that there was really a paucity of information about the status of most of the pollinators here in North America. So this was in part a call for programs to help collect additional information to give us insights into the status of pollinators in North America. The success of this study helped prompt the next major study, in this case a global study by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And once that IPBES program was established, its first assignment was to write a global assessment report on pollinators, pollination, and food production. Once again, a number of NAPPC scientists, including me, were involved in this project. And once again, we found that in many parts of the world, there just is insufficient information, not only about what the pollinators are doing, but who the pollinators are. And so this was in part, again, a call for additional study of pollinators around the world. One of the interesting things about this study is that we focused particularly on producing something that would be of use to policymakers around the world. And so we had a separate section of this report specifically for policymakers to summarize what we were able to find about pollinators and what they could do as policymakers to help protect pollinators and their role in pollination and food production. NAPPC has a number of task forces. You'll probably be participating in some of those task forces during this annual meeting, but I'll just point out a few of them. One is the Honeybee Health Task Force, which provides research grants for studies of honeybee health. Another goal of this task force is to provide practical information for beekeepers and to make sure that what we're funding and what we're encouraging will provide immediate applications and results for those beekeepers and for managers. There's also a NAPPC scientist report on honeybee stressors that's available for both beekeepers and for policymakers. NAPPC was behind the first postal stamps here in the United States that focused specifically on pollinators. And you can tell that this was a little bit ago because of the fact that these stamps were only 41 cents for first class. And there have actually been some subsequent issues of stamps for pollinators. And one of the NAPPC task forces is hoping that we can promote a semi-postal stamp that would help raise funds for pollinator research in the future. Here's a proclamation from the governor of Colorado issued for last year's Colorado Pollinator Week. And NAPPC is behind the establishment of a National Pollinator Week in June and getting proclamations now from all 50 states almost every year, establishing state pollinator weeks as well. So this is a great way to help call attention to the general public about the value and importance of pollinators in their states as well as nationally. NAPPC is focused on a number of educational programs, including for school kids. And this is an example, the Bee Smart School Garden Kit, which is available through the pollinator.org or NAPPC websites. NAPPC also focused several years ago on creating pollinator-friendly planting guides. So if you put in your zip code on this website, you can pop up a list of which plants would be particularly good for the ecoregion that you live in for promoting pollinators. So there's been a variety of educational programs for both the general public and for school kids, people of all ages, promoted by NAPPC. We've also created some products that are targeted more at the scientists who are interested in pollinators. Here's an example of a publication led by Howie Ginsberg that produced a paper called Management of Arthropod Vectors in North America, Minimizing Adverse Effects on Pollinators. There's a NAPPC task force that has a forthcoming letter to APHIS, the United States, the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, regarding sales and interstate movement tracking of bumblebees. So related to the white paper that we put out about managing bumblebee populations and not introducing new species to areas where they are not already established. I thought I'd say a little bit about insects in general, what's happened to insect populations in general during the 20 years of NAPPC's history, because there's been a lot of attention drawn to this recently in public things like newspapers, magazines, television shows. And unfortunately, the news is not good. Most of these headlines use the word, or all of these three use the word apocalypse, because of the fact that in general, insect populations seem to be declining, not only here in North America, but also around the world. There are a number of sites, fortunately, where we have data that are long-term enough that we can begin to determine trends of things like insect populations. And the bottom line is that terrestrial insect populations are declining by about 9% per decade. So almost 1% per year. This is not good news, not only for pollinators, but also for insectivores. For instance, birds that eat insects, insect-eating bird populations have been declining, probably in part because of the fact that their prey is declining. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about one study I've been involved in related to this and trying to answer the question, why are terrestrial insect populations declining? And this example comes from my field site in Southwest Colorado, the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, 9,500 feet, shown here in this picture. This is where I've spent a lot of time, almost every summer for 50 years now. And the red star there is the location of this project where we've been monitoring insect populations. And you can see that there are no buildings right next to it. There are no lights right next to it. There's no agriculture next to this site. But for every year since 1984, we have set up this insect trap called a malaise trap, named after the Swedish entomologist who invented it. What happens is that insects fly into this. They funnel up when they're caught in a tent or a trap. Their tendency is to fly up, and they fly up into that clear plexiglass jar at the top, where there's a pest strip, and they die there. And so for 2 days a week, we catch insects, and then we identify those insects, weigh them, and try and record this every week during the summer, and now every summer since 1984, as a way of keeping track of insect populations. Not all of them are pollinators, but many of them are. And the result, unfortunately, is the number of insects has declined since the 1980s. That line there shows the decline that we've recorded. There are a number of hypotheses for why insect populations in many parts of the world are declining. And some of the most logical hypotheses include pesticides, habitat fragmentation, artificial light, climate change. And as I've shown you in a previous slide, we can rule out at least the first 3 of these hypotheses for this particular site. We're not using pesticides. The habitat has not changed, at least because of human activity, direct human activity. There are no artificial lights there at night, so moth populations and other nocturnal insects are not attracted away from the trap. There has been climate change going on, that we do know. And there may be some other factors that we have not yet thought of that could be influencing these insect populations. But the bottom line is that they are declining here in this undisturbed site, as well as other places that are more disturbed. And that raises a lot of concern about insects in general and not just pollinators. So that's something that's been ongoing mostly since NAPPC was founded. Since NAPPC was founded, the first US bumblebee was officially listed as endangered, the rusty-patched bumblebee, or Bombus affinis. Another bumblebee species that could possibly be extinct, we're not absolutely sure yet. This is Bombus franklini, has a very restricted range in the Pacific Northwest and is considered a species of concern by the Fish and Wildlife Service and is listed as critically imperiled by the IUCN Red List of Endangered Species. But here's a picture of that bumblebee taken by NAPPC member Jamie Strange. Other information that points particularly at the bees is a comprehensive review of the more than 4,000 native bee species in North America and Hawaii done by the Center for Biological Diversity. They found that more than half of the species that had sufficient data to assess them are declining. Nearly 1 in 4 is imperiled and at increasing risk of extinction. Their report concluded that of the 1,437 native bee species for which there was sufficient data to evaluate them, about 749 were declining from a range of threats that include habitat loss and pesticides, and some 347 of the species, which are critical pollinators, are imperiled and at risk of extinction. So that is unfortunate news about the native bee species. So what do we still need to know about pollinators? We do know that there are slightly more than 4,000 native bee species in the USA. Here in Colorado, we have over 1,000 native bee species. Unfortunately, for most of those species, we have a very limited understanding of their distribution, where they occur, of their abundance, how that abundance changes, and ultimately what is their status. The USDA has just funded a research coordination network, which is trying to establish a national monitoring program for native bees. So I'm sure you'll be hearing more about that over the next few years. That grant was just recently funded, and there's several NAPPC members who are involved in that program, trying to establish this national monitoring program for native bees. We also need to know more about flies as pollinators, about beetles as pollinators, about what's the status of hummingbirds here in North America. This picture, although you may have guessed is a worker bumblebee, is actually a fly. This is a syrphid fly that's a good mimic of a bumblebee worker. And that's just an example of one of the flies that we really don't know very much about their status. We know something about their distribution from museum collections, but it would be great to know more about their value as pollinators and what their status is. So I've tried to highlight in this short talk a number of things that have changed about what we know about pollinators during NAPPC's 20-year history. And to highlight the fact that we need to know a lot more than we already do. We also need to help to raise people's appreciation, their understanding and appreciation of pollinators. And so many of the activities that NAPPC undertakes help to provide that public information about pollinators, things like our school materials, our eco-regional planning guides, the National Pollinator Week and the State Pollinator Week. And so I'd like to thank you for your support of NAPPC, your participation in the task forces you'll be learning more about during this meeting, and for your support for pollinators in general.
Hi, I'm Doug Tallamy, University of Delaware, and I want to talk to you about making insects. We have global insect decline, or at least a lot of evidence of it. So we've got to restore insects, we've got to create them. So I'm going to give you a little abbreviated guide on restoring the little things that run the world. Of course, that phrase, little things that run the world, comes from E.O. Wilson. It's probably the most famous entomologist of all time, certainly of our times. Way back in 1987, he wrote this paper, The Little Things That Run the World, The Importance and Conservation of Invertebrates, and his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if insects were to disappear, so would most flowering plants. It would not only change the physical structure of terrestrial habitats, but it would alter energy flow through those habitats to the point where food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and mammals would all collapse. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would lose insect decomposers and we'd only have bacteria and fungi left. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. Well, this was 1987, a pretty somber message, but it was largely ignored. Nobody was worried about losing insects. As a matter of fact, we were spending a lot more time worrying about how to kill them all. But that was a big mistake. And now we see headlines like this, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? And there's increasing evidence that insects are in decline. We've worried about pollinators, of course, but other insects are in decline as well. 50% of our Midwest native bee species have already disappeared from their historic range. There are 4 bumblebee species that have declined up to 96% in the last 20 years, so they're functionally extinct. We can find a few here and there, but they're functionally extinct. 3 bumblebee species may already be totally extinct, and 25% of them are at risk of extinction. Europe's looked at this a little bit more than we have. We got 30% of our European orthopterans, the grasshoppers and katydids and crickets, are facing extinction. Great Britain is losing its Lepidoptera. Germany, many of the important studies have come out of Germany, including the one that says they have lost 79% of their flying insects since 1989. 46 species of moths and butterflies have already disappeared from Germany. This is the big one by Durzo et al. Invertebrate abundance has declined 45% since 1974. And there's an increasing correlation between insect declines and bird declines during that same period, we see 432 species of North American birds threatened with extinction, according to the State of the Birds report. And last year, Rosenberg et al. Came out with a science paper saying we've lost 3 billion birds, population reduction by 3 billion birds in North America in the last 50 years. Well, we took a look at Rosenberg's et al.'s data. And the losses of the birds are not equal across species. If you divide birds into species that require insects at some point in their life history, that's most of them actually, then the average declines about 10 million individuals per species. But there are birds that do not require insects, particularly during breeding. The finches and doves, for example, they've actually gained a few million species or individuals. So tight correlation, that's not cause and effect, but it does suggest that the two are linked. What are the primary causes of insect declines? Certainly the misuse and overuse of pesticides, habitat loss, that's a big one, and of course invasive species cause habitat loss. Light pollution is of growing importance, and certainly climate change is typically targeted. Well, I'm going to focus on habitat loss and invasive species, particularly in terms of invasive plants today, and talk about how these things threaten insects because they threaten the specialized relationship that most insects have with plants. So if we're going to restore insect populations, we want to focus on where we're going to restore them and which insects we should restore. Let's talk about where first. You know, we've always thought about conservation in terms of natural areas that are not already disturbed. But 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So we cannot ignore private property when we're trying to restore ecosystem function. We've got to focus on properties like this because they are everywhere, not just homeowners, but corporate landscapes. They are not designed to support viable insect populations or the ecosystems that they run. Now there are two groups of insects that I think we should focus on. The ones that maintain plant diversity, and then the insects that transfer the energy from those plants to the food webs that support the rest of animal diversity. So we're talking about pollinators, and of course with this conference you all know how important pollinators are, but we're also talking about caterpillars. They are underappreciated in their role. So who says these are the two most important groups of insects? I do, and I'm giving this talk. But seriously, I know somebody's going to argue with that, but they are critically important. We cannot restore either pollinators or Lepidoptera, the caterpillars that support the food webs, if we ignore host plant specialization. So let's start with pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Of course, we always hear that we need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. Well, May Berenbaum has taken a look at that that figure, and she actually wonders where it comes from. And when she looks at our actual diet, it's closer to 1/7 of our crops rely on pollinators. I think the real reason we need to focus on pollinators is not agriculturally related. It's because pollinators, animals, and mostly insects and mostly native bees are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. That's not an option. Where do we need these pollinators? Everywhere. Everywhere where we need plants. Who are our major pollinators? And of course, we need plants everywhere. One species of honeybee introduced from Europe, extremely effective in agricultural settings, but we have 4,000 species of native bees that are also extremely effective, but underappreciated. We also have up to 14,000 species of moths and butterflies, about 2,000 of which are yet to be described. Now, most of these are not excellent pollinators, but some of them are. Some of them have very specific relationships with particular flowers. And many of them do pollination at night when we can't observe it, or we don't observe it, and it is vastly underappreciated. So because of their great numbers, we need to consider them. What species of plants should we put in the ground to help our native bees? If we're trying to create bee habitat in places where we've already destroyed it, which species should we focus on? Well, Sam Droege, Mr. Native Bee, says. He said lots of important things, but one of the ones that really resonates with me is, in terms of the plants that we use, we need to meet the needs of our specialists. Because if we plant for specialists, the generalists will also be able to use those plants. If we only plant for generalists, we lose our specialists. Why have so many bees specialized? And it's up to 35% of that 4,000 species of bees are pollen specialists. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera. It's because there's so much variation across plants in terms of when they flower, what they look like, what they smell like, the morphology of pollen. You know, all the little nooks and crannies there are probably adaptations to grab onto the particular hair morphology of particular bees. Nutritional value of pollen varies a great deal. So this all provides options for bees to specialize on particular plant lineages so that they become really good at transferring the pollen. So just to give you an idea, you can go to the Fowler and Droege website and see what the specialist bees are for your particular area. But I live in Pennsylvania, so these are some of the top plants supporting specialists where I live. The genus Helianthus, Aster, Solidago, just with those three, Salix too. I mean, you're talking about what, 45 species of bees that will not be in your yard if you don't have members of these genera. And then we go right down the line to a whole bunch of plants that only support a few. Okay, that's all we're going to say about planting for bees. We have to focus on the plants that are going to support the most specialist native bees. What about caterpillars? Well, caterpillars, we're talking about Lepidoptera, the larvae of Lepidoptera. They're not only important as pollinators as adults, but their larvae are essential in terms of sustaining food webs. When we're trying to restore functional ecosystems, it's not just pollinators. It's the whole shebang. We need to support all the species that run our ecosystems, and you're not going to do that without effective food webs. It turns out, and Dan Jansen talked about this way back in 1988, a lot of evidence that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. If you remove caterpillars from the system, so much of the energy remains locked up in plants because so many animals do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something is typically insects, and those insects are typically caterpillars. So if we're going to restore food webs in human-dominated landscapes, we have to landscape for caterpillars. How do we do that? How do you add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by adding the plants that make those caterpillars. That's pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most caterpillars are host plant specialists, so you have to add the plants on which they have specialized. Why? Why do we have so many specialists? Well, because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, added a bunch of physical defenses that deter most of the insects that are out there. It's an extremely effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there are not enough insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of those plants. But of course, we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? This is where the specialization comes in. They circumvent the defenses of one or two plant lineages for which they have developed specialized adaptations over evolutionary time. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify the defensive compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to particular chemicals or physical defenses. But again, all these adaptations require long periods of time to fall into place. That does not happen overnight. How many of our insects are specialists? It's hovering somewhere around 90% of plant eaters are specialists. They need the lineages on which they have specialized. But this is an underappreciated fact here. Most plants are really well defended, so well defended that they actually support very few caterpillar species. And here's just a smattering of data to convince you of that. Again, I live in Pennsylvania, so this is the mid-Atlantic states. There are 826 native plant genera. in the mid-Atlantic states. And this is the distribution of how many Lepidoptera species those genera support. There are very few that support a lot, like the genus Quercus, for example, supports up to 557 species of leps, but most support far fewer, and many of them support none, and many more. We're talking about hundreds of genera that support only 1 or 2 species of caterpillars. So if you're going to restore life to a particular area, you have to focus on these guys, the ones that are supporting a lot of species. And I'm calling those keystone plants. It turns out that we're only talking about native plants here now, that about 5% of our native plants are supporting about 75% of the caterpillar species that drive our food webs. 14% of our native plants support 90% of the caterpillar species that drive our food webs. So if we don't plant those very powerful genera, we really have failed food webs. The question used to be, are native plants better than non-native plants? And on average, they certainly are. But I can certainly build, or easily build, a landscape of 100% native plants that support very, very few caterpillars. And there will be a food web not strong enough to support even one breeding bird. So the question really is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our landscapes, or benign plants, or even worse, ecologically destructive plants, those ornamental plants that actually are highly invasive and escape and dilute our native areas? I get emails once or twice a year from somebody saying, don't I know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? And that makes them native, and that means people can plant them and everything will be great. That's not our metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not, it's whether they're productive. I don't care if ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago, they support 0 species of caterpillars. So if you're trying to restore food webs, that's not the way to do it. What is the best genus? Well, in 84% of the counties in North America, it is Quercus, it is oaks. Again, in the mid-Atlantic states, 557 species of caterpillars, or 557 species of bird food, over 900 species of Lepidoptera supported by Quercus nationwide. There's no other genus that comes close to that. How do you know what the keystone plants are for your particular county? You can go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of plant genera, both woody plants and herbaceous plants for your particular county, will pop up. And this is they're ranked in terms of their ability to be a host plant for caterpillars. Notice we're talking about native oaks, native cherries, native willows. You have to use the native species in here. We have about 90 species of native oaks. I don't know why you'd want to use a Chinese oak, but if you use non-native members of these particular genera, you're going to reduce caterpillar use by 68%. We got that figure from large common garden experiment years ago. What happens when you don't landscape with keystone plants in mind, or if we allow our ornamental plants to escape into our natural areas and become serious invasive species? Throughout much of the mid-Atlantic and many parts of the US in general, invasive species are now a feature of our little habitat fragments, and up to 30% of the plant biomass in those areas are non-native plants. What you're looking at here, this is White Clay Creek State Park in Delaware. Every bit of green you see there is an escaped ornamental plant. Plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. So I took this picture in March, and it gives you a good feeling for the impact or the degree to which these non-native plants have displaced native plant communities. We did a study. Just a few years, came out last year. Very simple study, just went into woodlots, or not woodlots, hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware that were heavily invaded. So this one's invaded with autumn olive and multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and on and on and on. And compared caterpillar communities in a standardized way with hedgerows, the caterpillar communities and hedgerows that are not invaded. The trick was finding ones that are not filled with invasive species, but we did find enough. And what we found was that the number of species of caterpillars in the invaded hedgerows were reduced 68%. The abundance of those caterpillars was reduced 91%, and the biomass of those caterpillars was reduced 96%. So we're talking about bird food, really. The amount of energy available to birds in these invaded hedgerows was reduced 96%. Let me just briefly remind you that when birds are breeding, they are not rearing their young on berries or seeds, they're rearing them on insects. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. So this is a serious blow to food webs. Take-home message of this entire talk is that plant specialization cannot be ignored in our restoration, both for native bees and for caterpillars. Plant choice matters. Thanks very much.
Hi, this is Sam Droege, and I'm giving this talk with there's mosquitoes out here, with Jared Fowler. I'm with USGS Bee Lab. Jared is a private consultant, works on specialist plants, and did a lot of the bulk of the investigations in terms of patterns of specialist bees. I only have 20 minutes, so moving on. What I want to do today is talk about the specialist bees. So when we think about plants and animals in general, and the conservation of those plants and animals, we're really focused down into the categories. If I'm interested in yellow-breasted chats, I'm going to emphasize scrub. If I'm interested in waterfowl, wetlands, flamingos, salt flats, and on down the line. So the same thing would be true for bees, but we really haven't gotten to that level. We know relatively little about the different species and their interactions with plants and their needs, but I think that's where we are now. We need to move into a little more sophistication in terms of how we do the conservation of bees on our public and even in our private lands. So today we're really just going to emphasize the relationship between some bees and some plants that are highly specialized and talk about why we would want to move in that direction in terms of their conservation or the conservation of bees in general. So if we look at this from a point of view, and I'm giving away the end of the talk right now in a lot of ways, we're emphasizing specialist bee plants, and about 60% of the specialist pollinators are very rare. In other words, we really need to think about them more because we're interested in the conservation of things that are uncommon in general more than are common. Adding fields filled with pollinators is good, but we're losing a lot of habitat. It's becoming less and less biodiverse. That means we have to focus more and more on emphasizing certain parts of the environment. Anything we do for specialists will bring along a lot of the generalists because the generalists often use the same plants that the specialists do too. Not in all cases, but in many. So roughly 4,000 species of bees north of Mexico. There's about 3,600 names in use, some of which are out of date. There's about 400 or so species probably, maybe more, maybe less. We don't even know how many don't have names yet. So there's a lot of work to do, and it's no wonder we don't know much about the individual species needs and their life histories when we don't even know their names. So something we always need to keep in mind when we're talking about funding and what we need to do for bees is we have a lot of basic work that still needs to be done. About 20% of all the bee species are nest parasites. So by nest parasites, that means that they are invading the nests of other bee species. They're not gathering pollen directly, so therefore, in some ways, they can't be specialist bees. But in some cases, these nest parasites are parasitizing bees that are highly specialized, and therefore they're equally as vulnerable to the conservation. Jared and I have not tried to characterize which nest parasites are parasitizing specialized bees because we know even less about these kleptoparasitic bee species in terms of their life history and their host preferences. Another huge unknown, but that they come along with the conservation and management for specialized bees. So every bee species has preference, including the honeybee, the most generic of all bees in terms of their tastes and their abilities to gather pollen from lots of sources. That varies by season, by time, what's available, and the architecture and the equipment each individual bee has. We're going to define here, and because there is such a range, we have to define what specialization is, because it's not an on-off switch, specialist, non-specialist. You can be highly specialized. One species of plant is all you're going to gather pollen from, and it is all about pollen. Or you can be like, I only do Asteraceae, and then it is everything in between. And then as you get into the generalist points of view, it gets more and more towards preferences, and things shift with each situation in terms of what the bloom is in an area. So we need a lot more investigation into this. Jared's done a great job compiling lists of what we know and think are specialized bee relationships, but it's something that every year we find out something new. Sometimes it's like all of a sudden we've discovered new specialization relationships, and other times it's like we thought this was highly specialized, but we're now seeing that they actually use a much broader range of plant species. In all conservation of bees, not all, but let's say 80 to 90% of what you're going to do is managing plants. So in a lot of cases, it's a conservative approach to look at lists of the plant groups, of which there are many that are highly specialized. On the screen here, and we'll put it into the comment section, is a link to Jared's work, and it has all these lists of specialized bees, the ones that we're aware of, and a list of plants that have specialization. And this is where you should start in a lot of cases in terms of thinking about what is it that we're going to emphasize in terms of the conservation of bees. So you would look at the plant list and the species list and your geographic area, and hopefully you know something about at least the plants in the area. Most people have no idea what bees are there, and there's an opportunity. I've got a set of highly specialized plants, or plants that have specialist bees on. You can target that for investigation in terms of doing some kind of preliminary bee list, rather than something more open-ended where you're putting out bowls or traps and catching whatever comes along. This again gives you more information in terms of doing your management. Patterns and specialization, it's almost all about perennials and shrubs. Relatively few annuals have specialist bees. There are almost no trees. Chestnut is a really interesting exception. Jared's compiled these lists, and there's about 250 host genera of plants, and maybe about 7,000 plant species in play here, and dozens of plant families. So it's not just a small subset, and any landscape is going to have a lot of different opportunities, and you might be doing some targeted conservation for in terms of planning as a management. In the east, there's about 777 species of bees. 25% of those are highly specialized. If you include all the bees, including the nest parasites, that turns to 30% if you just deal with pollen carrying. Similarly, in central, 1,800 bee species, 30% specialist, 38% if it's just pollen carrying. And then at west, and you'll notice a pattern of increased specialization as you go to the west, 35% of all bee species are plant specialists, 43 of the pollen carrying. Go to the deserts in the deep southwest, and you're up towards 50% or perhaps even more. We know relatively little. The deserts are where a lot of our unknown species are lounging around with some good taxonomists to come in. Pollinator mixes, this is what we plant. This is a lot of what people do. They got the message, bees are in trouble, pollinators are in trouble, and they go to seed mixes to plant old soybean and tobacco fields or whatever it might be, or rangelands. And all these things are good. There will be, you plant flowers, bees will come to it. The question is, what are you helping, and is that of the greatest conservation benefit that you could make for that particular situation? I would argue that a lot of these initial mixes are good, but you're mostly supporting these generalist bees, the crows and sparrows, things that don't necessarily need our help specifically because they're adapted to disturbed habitats, which your old field might just be because of the way. Rather, and then you look at seed mixes, relatively small diversity. All these plants have different bee species that come to them, but if you plant only, 10 to 18 species of plants, that may not really be of greatest benefit. Again, easy to grow plants might basically have a lot of the bees that already are in good shape. So look around, see what's growing on your refuge, your park, your rangeland, or conservation area. Look at those lists of specialist bees that Jared has put together. Do some targeted bee collection if you want, but really you can skip the last part and just focus on augmenting in different ways the numbers and types of specialist bees in the area. A lot of these things are surprising in terms of what has a relationship with bees that wouldn't necessarily leap to mind, that are often highly specialized, and again need our care and tending to increase the overall biodiversity of the area. Will also increase the overall biodiversity of the bee species. So here's just a smattering. Again, you can look at the lists: dodder, pickleweed, willow, grass of Parnassus, death camas, spurges, California poppy, prickly pear, crinkle mat, morning glory, and gourds all have bees that only are largely are focused on those sets of bee species, or specialist bee species. They have their own bees, in other words. So no prickly pear, all the prickly pear bees are absent, and each of those plants, if absent, because bees are much more tied to the plant than the plants are tied to sets of bees. So again, we just go back to biodiversity is going to bring in a lot of these plants, a lot of these bees. Then you might not even know about the bee species presence or absence, but that should be what you're looking at. Rather than doing seedings, because it's difficult in a lot of ways, some of these conservation plants of concern, you would actually go out and gather seeds or cuttings or splits of the species you have, augment them in your, around your shop or at your homes, and then plant them back and look at what's the best mechanism. We don't have time to talk about that, but this is probably a much more effective way of bringing in plant groups and planting new areas that have been under the plow or some other kind of area. Some of these plants don't invade or are in seed selection, so you'll have to do a little bit of extra work. We're wrapping up the talk now. So preservation of complex landscapes, really where a lot of the action is, okay? These are places like refuges and national parks and BLM landscapes and things that already are in a largely naturalized state. You want to go back in rather than plowing up lands or taking out farmland per se. You want to look at what's going on within that region that you have control of and decrease your elk, deer, hog populations that are preferentially chewing up a lot of your native plant communities, allowing invasives in, control of invasive plants. Where there's an invasive plant, there is no native plant, right? So that is cooking the system. You have some sort of idea probably of the botany and the natural history of the region that you would want to emphasize and well, that you would want to cross-check against Jared's lists and look at, well, what kinds of things could we be doing to some of these uncommon groups of bees, and then look at what your options are. Bringing in fire disturbance is often one that is missing from a lot of these eastern components, bringing back the prairie component, bringing back more open country diversity. Lists of natural heritage species of special concern often are almost primarily transitional disturbance related groups of plants in the east and the central states. We have forests, yes, but even within the forests, we have sets of vernal plants that often are missing when we just plant back new forests. We need to bring those, which often have all sorts of specialized bees in them, back into the system. We have to look at these ericaceous shrub communities that are in some forest communities, open them up so that they bloom. You know, a lot of times you have plants that are just simply repressed. They're not providing pollen and nectar because they're waiting for something to open up the community. And that is it. Here is Jared and my contact information. The pictures are on this talk are all public domain. You can follow us and learn all kinds of juicy tidbits and details on our various social media sites. Visit Jared's lovely compilations on the web to learn more about what species of plant groups to emphasize, links to the bee species, and you can learn a lot more by poking around on the internet. Time to learn more details about the natural history of bees, simply planting pollinator mixes is really not so acceptable now. It'd be like putting up bird feeders to save birds. Okay, we can do better. And if you have any questions, I believe that there is a discussion session after this. So Jared and I will both be on the phone, and I am going to sign out now.
Thank you, Miles. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today for the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. As Miles mentioned, my name is Christine Taliga. I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service as National Ecologist, and I'll be presenting on the North American grasslands and pollinator conservation opportunities here today. So for context, let's look at the global picture. Grasslands occupy the most extensive global coverage of any ecosystem at nearly 41% of the Earth's surface, linked to 38% of the global population, with approximately 70% of the food produced from these regions. Grasslands include some of the world's most challenging ecosystems, which are greatly influenced by drought, grazing, and fire. Grasslands provide critical services, including provisioning for food and fiber, habitat for wildlife and pollinators, nutrient cycling, and carbon storage. They are integrally linked to the livelihood of communities where they occur. There are two main kinds of grasslands, tropical and temperate. Examples of tropical grasslands include the hot savannas of sub-Saharan Africa and northern Australia, but we are going to concentrate on the temperate grasslands. Those examples include the Eurasian steppes, the North American prairies, which we'll concentrate on here, and the Argentine pampas. The North American grasslands are the most extensive vegetation type in this area, covering approximately 15% of the land surface. However, only about 40% of the original extent currently remain. The type of grasslands in North America are greatly influenced by precipitation and temperature patterns. The precipitation generally increases from west to east, and the temperatures generally increase from northern latitudes to southern latitudes. So these North American grasslands in context of private land show us that 2/3 of the lower 48 states are currently privately owned farms, ranches, and forests, which is where the nation produces the majority of its food and fiber. And nearly 70% of the nation's wildlife habitat is found on these private lands. So NRCS works very, very close in partnership with agricultural producers and conservation partners to maintain productive working lands while integrating environmentally sound practices. Now, NRCS's history and mission is centered and originates back to the 1930s, when persistent drought caused widespread crop failure and severe erosion in the central U.S., resulting in dust storms that swept across the country and led Congress to create the first permanent soil conservation agency. Today, NRCS has 90% of its staff located in field offices found in nearly every county throughout the United States. And these counties utilize conservation programs funded by the 2018 Farm Bill to support voluntary and incentive-based land management and conservation actions for agricultural production and environmental quality. So why grasslands? Since 2/3 of U.S. grasslands are privately owned, Almost all of these are maintained through the use of sustainable livestock grazing as a primary land use. And the inherent recreational value really offers unique opportunities for all citizens to enjoy nature and native lands, as well as some key ecosystem functions where the wealth of grasslands provides our ecosystem with sufficient clean water that helps prevent floods and promotes the natural production of food crops and meats. Grasslands are also essential to carbon sequestration, which is crucial to soil health. As I mentioned earlier, these grasslands are maintained through disturbance regimes such as periodic drought, frequent burning, and grazing. And the varied climate of grasslands promotes adaptation to these disturbance factors. The ratio of woody vegetation to grasses is affected by increasing fire frequency, increasing sunlight, and periodic drought. The biodiversity these grasslands harbor is truly amazing. Approximately 80% of the forage from grasslands is attributed to grass and grass-like species, but approximately 80% of the diversity stems from forbs wildflower species. For example, Chris Helsler with the Nature Conservancy conducted a study in 2018 where he monitored a 1 quarter meter plot throughout the year, and he noted as many as 100 different species occurring in that 1 quarter meter plot throughout 2018. Another example of the diversity of grassland species can be seen here when looking at the eastern plains of the shortgrass prairie system in Colorado. There are 2,685 native plant species, and the lion's share of that diversity stems again from forb species in these systems. The diversity of grasslands that you can see above ground really pales in comparison to the below ground systems. Below ground, there's a huge diversity of root systems. Compass plant, one of the standard forbs of tallgrass prairie, has been noted to reach as much as 10 meters in depth in the soil horizon. So 90% of the grassland biomass is actually below ground, and the levels of soil carbon are higher in grassland than in forests, agroecosystems, and other ecosystems. Carbon storage is particularly high in high latitudes where decomposition rates are generally lower and soil organic matter and carbon stocks tend to build up. An example of this incredible below ground diversity can be shown here by the bush morning glory Ipomeo leptophylla. This is an example from a southeast Colorado field office where a tile line was dug and this bush morning glory was excavated. It's an incredible taproot, and it just shows the diversity of below ground workings of these incredible grasslands. Now, carbon storage and nutrient cycling are also very important factors in grasslands that really contribute to soil stability and support, water relations, filtering and buffering, biodiversity, and habitat. These below ground interactions have a huge impact on the above ground net primary productivity of these grasslands, with many mutualistic interactions that are important for the successional development in plant communities and thought to play critical roles in plant assembly and structure, as well as plant regeneration. These above and below ground interactions really allow the temperate grasslands to maintain all of their bases covered in the face of changing climates and drought and grazing and other factors, disturbance factors built into the system. If one plant or animal or microbe is unable to fulfill the role, there's another one to step in its place. This really provides an incredible amount of resiliency to any type of disturbance of these systems. So biodiversity of grasslands builds in and provides a redundancy that really helps these grasslands maintain and stay healthy systems. As I mentioned before, the high biodiversity above ground tends to increase the stability of ecosystem functioning when faced with a changing environment. Competition in grasslands involves biotic factors such as interactions of pollinators, microfauna, and flora below ground, and abiotic factors such as light above ground, soil nutrients, and moisture. The schematic illustrating how soil biota regulate the temporal stability above ground through net primary production. In grasslands, most of the primary production is underground, however, and the rhizosphere, where roots and root byproducts support a distinctive, complex microfloral, microfaunal community. Biomass turnover rates are higher in tropical grasslands, but temperate grasslands support a larger biomass of producers and consumers. Two trophic pathways are important. Root grazers can significantly reduce net primary productivity, and microbial grazers increase rates of decomposition and mineralization. Thus, the decomposers may increase nutrient concentrations in soil and water and plant tissues. So a ubiquitous microfauna involved in these processes is found in all grasslands, but certain keystone species in some grasslands, such as ants or termites, may have overriding influences. All of these diverse biotic and abiotic interactions result in incredible infiltration capacity and increase in water quality that these grasslands provide, as can be seen in this photo from Iowa State University running transects through prairie, 10% prairie and 90% crop and 100% crop systems. You can see the unbelievable water quality filtration capacity that these grasslands possess. Now, with these many multiple benefits of grasslands, there's certainly, we do have our share of threats that currently impact grasslands in North America. And those threats aren't limited to these factors, but the main components of threats include a changing weather patterns that result in extreme drought, extreme moisture regimes, population pressure of a growing population and the development that ensues along with that, invasive species pressure, and certainly altered disturbance regimes. Certainly these threats also impact pollinators. This has been seen by the annual winter colony honeybee loss rate, which has continued to increase over the years. The eastern and western monarch populations and native pollinators overall are increasingly hugely important in agricultural pollination services. And so these decreases in the bee populations very significantly not only affect grasslands, but also the croplands adjoining those systems. To address some of these conservation issues and concerns, NRCS uses a conservation planning process where through voluntary cooperation with landowners, NRCS professional planning staff are able to work on private lands to identify problems and highlight opportunities for conservation opportunities, determine determining the objectives with the landowners, inventorying and analyzing the resource data, and evaluating opportunities which result in ultimately the development of a conservation plan to address the identified resource concerns. Through this conservation planning process, there are opportunities to highlight what some of the beneficial functions of these grasslands are for the landowners, which include plant productivity, rangeland health, wildlife habitat, reducing the occurrence of invasive species and controlling erosion, just to name a few items. And then you can also turn that around during the conservation planning process to see what are you doing for the soil and how do you protect soil function and rangeland health. And this is to maintain or increase litter cover or promote your plant productivity out on these grasslands, encourage diverse species and encourage plants with high root mass and reduce bare areas, just as an example of some of the conversations that we can have with private landowners to address resource concerns on these grasslands. In addition to the conservation planning process, through the 2018 Farm Bill, you can see $29 billion of funds dedicated to the conservation of working lands, and that includes financial and technical assistance. It includes delivery through easement program and partnerships which leverage additional conservation assistance for landowners in priority conservation areas. Certainly, there are ample opportunities to promote pollinators, such as this Equip Honeybee initiative on rangelands and across other working lands. Another example of some of the conservation opportunities include this Cheatgrass Challenge, which is a multi-state effort with Idaho leading the pack to identify areas to address the challenges to grasslands caused by invasive species such as cheatgrass. Another example of partnership conservation efforts is this of the native woody species invasion control in the central Great Plains through improved conservation outcomes on U.S. rangelands, treating eastern red cedar and mesquite, pinyon pine, and western juniper. Now, as we're looking at these conservation planning opportunities across the temperate grasslands for pollinator conservation, we see lots of opportunities in terms of monarch conservation, which really impact many of these grassland areas through the central flyway. And then also the patterns of movement of honeybees. You can see that the central grasslands are a key area for conservation opportunities and habitat establishment for bees. One of our premier conservation programs includes the Working Lands for Wildlife program, where really the past focus has maybe been on some individual species across the Working Lands for Wildlife project areas, which also overlaps a great deal into the central temperate grassland zone. And now the take-home message really to maintain these intact grasslands is to promote multi-species conservation, which reaps the benefits of not just specific species such as lesser prairie chicken, but also the multiple benefits of these conservation efforts for pollinators such as native bees, honeybees, and monarch butterflies. Through the Working Lands for Wildlife Great Plains effort, there are really 4 primary rangeland threats, which might sound familiar when we were looking at the temperate grassland region area, and those are woodland expansion, exotic annual grass invasion, land use conversion, and riparian and meadow degradation. Working lands for wildlife really has taken the three geographies of the sage grouse, the southwest willow flycatcher, and the Great Plains Grassland Initiative to reach 90% of the rangelands in the U.S. And these efforts promote pollinators and productive lands and healthy environments. You can see over the years, we've had quite a bit of an increase in financial and technical assistance for pollinator efforts. And hopefully those efforts will continue to increase to provide needed habitat conservation efforts for both working lands and for the wildlife benefit. Now, these conservation efforts really multi-pronged, and it is absolutely crucial that partnerships such as working with Pollinator Partnership and others are absolute key in NRCS achieving its mission of productive working lands in harmony with a healthy environment. It is through these partnership efforts that we hope to achieve synergy in conservation on private lands, promoting food and fiber and a healthy environment for all to enjoy and multiple generations to come. Thank you so much for your time and attention to the presentation, and I look forward to any of your questions that you might have regarding this presentation. Thank you again.
Hi, my name is Gary Krupnick, and I head the Plant Conservation Unit at Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I'm speaking today from Rockville, Maryland, which is also the traditional territory of the Piscataway. For the past 16 years, I have served on the steering committee of NAPPC, and I currently serve as the committee's U.S. Vice Chair. Now, building a strong, diverse international coalition of partners and using the tools of science are key elements to solving the pollinator crisis. NAPPC task forces have produced a number of public-facing products that have given voice to pollinators. Task forces are cross-disciplinary, short-term, project-oriented groupings designed to accomplish a single task within a year. The tools that these task forces have created have inspired audiences of all ages, ethnicities, educational levels, and backgrounds to join us in our movement to stop pollinator decline. Early in NAPPC's history, a task force worked for 4 years on the creation of a National Academy of Sciences NRC panel, which issued the first scientific-based reporting demonstrating major pollinator decline in North America. This was published in 2006. Another task force successfully petitioned for a 2007 U.S. Postal Series stamp series illustrating pollinators in action, raising the profile of pollinators nationwide. In 2007, NAPPC partners Laurie Adams of Pollinator Partnership and Larry Stritch of the U.S. Forest Service wanted to draw the public into a conversation about helping pollinators. They helped write a national proclamation for Pollinator Week. The proclamation was signed by the U.S. Secretaries of the Agriculture and Interior Departments. They have continued to sign the proclamation every year since. Citizens have also been requesting proclamations from their state governors, and over the years, all 50 states have signed on. Each proclamation declares the importance of pollinators to ecosystem health, the food supply, and sustaining local and rural economies. And from each proclamation of Pollinator Week arises more local, national, and international public interest in celebrating pollinators, from pollinator festivals to native wildflower walks to film and art installations. Last year, pollinator.org registered 380 events in 10 countries around the world. NAPPC task forces have also produced year-round tools for educators, homeowners, families, and school children. Nature's Partners is a comprehensive pollinator curriculum for children in grades 3 through 6. This curriculum was the product of a NAPPC task force involving a team of partners from federal and state agencies and nonprofits in the educational sectors. The curriculum contains science-based activities separated in 6 modules, from why pollinators are important to how students can help pollinators in their own backyard. To encourage homeowners to plant pollinator gardens, NAPPC produced ecoregional planting guides. In my role representing the Smithsonian, I was part of a team that provided concept review of each guide. These guides are called Selecting Plants for Pollinators, and there are 62 in total, 34 for the US and 28 for Canada. The beauty of these planting guides is that they are specific to each ecological region, and each guide provides a list of plants that will attract pollinators. For those who don't even know where to start in planting a garden, a NAPPC task force this year made garden recipe cards. Like a food recipe card, these cards have ingredients, steps to prepare your dish, and pictures for new chefs. But instead of ingredients, these recipes have a list of suggested plants that you should be able to find at your local nursery. And instead of cooking directions, these cards provide instructions on how to plant your garden. On the flip side of each card, instead of a picture of your meal, these recipe cards have pictures of the plants that you will plant. Separated by blooming season, you can see which plants will be blooming during spring, summer, and fall. Having plants in your garden that bloom each season provides pollinators with food from early spring to the end of fall. Cards from 4 regions in the US are available for download at pollinator.org now, and future ecoregions will be featured shortly. NAPPC task forces and pollinators have also produced a series of brochures on a variety of themes, from bee-friendly farming to bats as tropical pollinators, and the relations of pollinators within different world religions. Another tool that NAPPC has produced are educational posters, a different one each year. Our first set of posters were fantastic introductory tools to bring attention to what pollinators are and why they are important in maintaining habitats, ecosystems, and how they benefit humankind. To showcase the collaborative spirit of NAPPC, each poster features the logos of NAPPC partners and other sponsors at the bottom of the posters. Posters are sent to schools and educational groups throughout North America, and NAPPC partners also share their posters within their networks. In 2012, the posters took a new direction. We began to focus on specific themes and looked at specific plant-animal interactions. The 2012 poster, called Pollinator Pathways, examined 4 migratory species, a bat species, 2 hummingbird species, and the monarch butterfly. It also featured 12 different plant species that are pollinated by these animals. In 2014, I joined the Pollinator Week poster task force, and we focused on orchid species and the pollinators that visit them. It highlighted 7 different plant-animal interactions native to Canada, the US, and Mexico. This poster was produced in collaboration with the North American Orchid Conservation Center, a group focused on protecting all orchid species of North America. And it highlights interesting interactions that might usually go unnoticed by the general public, such as a Canadian orchid shown in the center of the top row of this poster. This is the blunt-leaved orchid Platanthera obtusata being pollinated by a mosquito, Aedes communis. Other posters over the years include They Don't Eat Their Pollinators, a poster about carnivorous plants and how they separate their animal traps from their pollinators. Trees for Bees focused on the importance of tree species as important food sources for pollinators. This poster was so popular that the American Horticultural Society helped display this poster in many nurseries across the country. The Monarch Highway gave detail about the monarch migration, and last year's poster, Endangered Pollinators and Their Habitats, provided information on 22 endangered pollinators and the plants that depend on them. As a side note, the Carnivorous Plants poster featured the Venus flytrap. To get the science correct, we wanted to feature the exact species that pollinates the Venus flytrap in the wild. When the poster was produced, however, we noted that there was not a single published study on what pollinates this plant in the wild, which is arguably the most famous carnivorous plant in North America. After the poster's release, a professor in North Carolina conducted a study and found that a sweat bee and 2 beetle species are confirmed pollinators for the Venus flytrap. So these posters can actually lead to interesting scientific studies. This year's poster, Our Future Flies with Pollinators, was released this past April and is available for download and purchase on pollinator.org. It features 6 plant-animal interactions in the center circle and also features 12 ecosystem services outside of the circle. Pollinators and native plants provide many ecosystem services and support the health of people and the planet, and this poster highlights those services. We're still a ways away from solving the pollinator crisis, but NAPPC task forces that work collaboratively with science, partnerships, and public-facing tools will keep magnifying the voice of pollinators. The key to NAPPC's success is that NAPPC task forces base all decisions on science. NAPPC has involved stakeholders from many perspectives built on collaboration and trust. NAPPC's progress has been incremental and strategic. And NAPPC partners share resources, we share opportunities, and we share credit. NAPPC is the successful model for collaborative conservation. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the NAPPC meeting today.